A little bird, or maybe it's more like an eagle, has been telling me that you guys want me to talk more about Tolkien. And I do love talking about Tolkien, but sometimes I feel like what is it? Why is it that we want to talk so much about Tolkien? Is it because we want to read more books like The Lord of the Rings? Wish that we had yet another book like The Lord of the Rings, or is it because we want to write books like The Lord of the Rings? Well, I'm here to tell you tonight, flying solo, because we're going to focus tonight on some fairly sort of complex and difficult problems of creativity. I'm here to tell you tonight that it's very, very easy to learn to write like Tolkien. All you need to do is learn to scan. Welcome to the Mosaic Ark. So here I am. It's just me. It's just me. I've got Casey has gone off traveling somewheres and mountains and rivers and I don't know where. And it's like, and I'm going to be traveling in a little bit. And we felt like we needed to do a sort of anchor episode to make sure that you all understand that you understand the harbor that the Mosaic Ark sails from and why we do the work that we do in the Dragon Common Room. And this plea, I appreciate the plea to say more about Tolkien. I'm gonna have to. I was like, I'm feeling a little vexed. I am, because we're talking about Tolkien all the time. We are never not talking about Tolkien because we, in fact, in the Dragon Common Room, note title Dragon, live in the world that J.R.R. Tolkien described so beautifully. We live here in Middle Earth, our habitation, and we participate in the joy that Tolkien says that he always felt with him daily, which was praising our Lord Jesus Christ through the Psalms and the other prayers of blessing and salvation. So I say we because I am here in this project with a number of other people, but you will remember me from my early days in unauthorized TV after medieval history and before Logos. I did a series of videos, I think there are 42 of them appropriately, on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and his creative practice. Having spent, this was the last time I was on academic leave, and it seems like a lifetime ago, and yet only four years ago, the cycle of leaves that I get to be on. Having spent a year in 2020, 2021, talking through how I see what Tolkien was trying to achieve with his storytelling and his method, his sort of backstory and training and reading and so forth. I had to do what Tolkien did, right? And this is, I think it's a sort of like what's the most appropriate response to our idols. Well, if our God is not in fact a made thing, an artifact of human fashioning, a little statue of wood perhaps covered in gold, but actually the creator of heaven and earth, Tolkien's understanding was we should respond in the fashion that in which we were made, that we are called in Tolkien's famous phraseology to subcreate, to make still, by the law in which we were made. And so those of us who have been working in the Dragon Common Room with me, in fact, the same 4 years, we started in summer 2020, the same summer I started my Tolkien videos on Unauthorized, having absorbed the lesson of, what it means to think through Tolkien's stories and his craft, we went on then to want to write our own stories, which is in fact what Tolkien said he was doing. But there's a sort of paradox in this, if we are being more not more Tolkien than Tolkien, as Tolkien, will you be able to tell? And I say, the little bird, the screeching eagle, it's been telling me you must talk more about Tolkien. I tell you that we have been doing nothing but talking about Tolkien. But what I need to show you, I think, tonight in this episode is, in fact, why that's the case, because the more sort of poetically and in fairy embeddedness with dragons that we talk, it seems the less people can see that that is in fact what we've been doing all along. So preface, apology, here we go. We're talking about why what we do in the Dragon Common Room with our storytelling is always in homage and tribute to the lessons that we learned from Professor Tolkien himself. And to think about it, it's like, this is you always know that this is the way Lewis and Tolkien got their own start. This is we live in the meme world, and that's appropriate. But this passage that we're quoting here, if they won't write the kinds of books we like to read, we shall have to write them ourselves, which is saying C.S. Lewis in a letter to J.R.R. Tolkien. It's actually in a letter of J.R.R. Tolkien, and he's remembering what Jack had said to him. He was writing, Tolkien himself was writing to Dora Marshall in March 1955, and she had been reading The Lord of the Rings. It's like a reply to a letter from a reader of The Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien was talking about the struggles that he had had with getting anybody to pay attention whatsoever to what he'd been doing. I have no idea why that would feel so painful. Anyway, so he writes to Dora Marshall. I had great difficulty, says Professor Tolkien. It took several years to get my story published. We do wonder, we in the Dragon Common Room, whether Tolkien would have, if he had had the opportunity that we have had, thanks to, modern technologies and platforms, to simply publish them himself, whether he would have gone ahead and done that. But anyway, I had great difficulty to get my story published, and it is not easy to say who is most surprised at the result, myself or the publishers. But it remains an unfailing delight to me to find my own belief justified, that the fairy story is really an adult genre, and one for which a starving audience exists. Now, he's writing this in 1955. He'd actually finished writing The Lord of the Rings some years before that, but it was, if any of you have read the rest of his letters, it was an enormous struggle for Tolkien, even with the best-selling reputation that he had with The Hobbit, to get The Lord of the Rings published. Everyone was convinced that nobody would want to read this book, right? And I talk about that. A lot of what I'm doing tonight is praising some of the stuff I've said in the unauthorized videos, the Forge of Tolkien videos, but there were critics even when The Lord of the Rings came out. The critics hated it, right? Edmund Wilson famously writes the review for I can't remember what the journal was, a review, maybe. Ooh, those awful orcs, right? It's not even scary. The spiders aren't. It's a boy's story. Germaine Greer famously, talks about how she's haunted and horrified by the idea that the Lord of the Rings would become the most popular book in the 20th century. It's so easy in retrospect to say, well, of course everybody would have immediately figured out that the Lord of the Rings was the most popular book of the 20th century when it came out. That's not what happened. It wasn't what the publishers thought. They wanted more hobbits. They were persistently telling Tolkien, you should write more of what we already have, because that's what publishers like. They like what they think are guaranteed successes, because they want in the genre that they are already familiar with. And Tolkien and Lewis were both sitting there. This is, they're talking maybe, 20 years before, as you'll see, The Lord of the Rings was actually published, saying nobody writes the kinds of books we want to write, we want to read, so we're just going to have to write them ourselves. Now, he goes on to say, he's talking about fairy stories and his struggle and his own scholarship with, making a fairy story something that was actually something for grown-ups. Again, there's whole conventions now, sci-fi and fantasy conventions. Fantasy is an entire genre now. It's incredibly difficult to, imagine what it was like for Tolkien writing into a genre that did not exist. Okay. So he says, fairy story for which a starving audience exists. He was right, but his publishers didn't believe him. I said so more or less in my essay on the fairy story in the collection dedicated to the memory of Charles Williams. Now, that essay had come out, this is letter 1955, that essay had come out 8 years before this, 1947. Yeah, 8 years before that. But it was a mere proposition which awaited proof. As C.S. Lewis said to me long ago, more or less, I do not suppose my memory of his dicta is any more precisely accurate than his of mine. And this is where the meme quotation comes from. He says, I often find strange things attributed to me in his works. Okay. Anyway, he's saying C.S. Lewis, Tolkien writes in nothing but parenthetical statements. So if you're bothered with me, just pretend I'm Tolkien. I should get a pipe. Lewis tells, he says, he remembered that Lewis said to him, if they won't write the kinds of books we want to read, we shall have to write them ourselves. But it is very laborious. Now, again, if you know what it took for Tolkien to write The Lord of the Rings, it was a good decade's worth of work, and then, half a decade of frustration trying to get his publisher to publish it. But anyway, being a man of immense power and industry, this is Tolkien talking about Lewis, his trilogy was finished much sooner, much other work. It's true, Lewis wrote way faster than Tolkien. But we here on the Mosaic Ark are particular fans of Tolkien precisely because he put the craft that he did into his work, right? But at last, my slower and more meticulous, as well as more indolent and less organized, machine has produced its effort. The labor! I have typed myself nearly all of it twice, and parts more often. So he did actually have to effectively self-publish in the sense that he had to type it out, right? Not to mention the written stages. But I am amply rewarded and encouraged to find that the labor was not wasted. One such letter as yours is sufficient and furnishes more than any author ought to ask. Some of the letters that are published in I forgot his Humphrey Carpenter's edition, weren't ever sent, right? Tolkien got lots and lots of letters from happy readers after the book came out, and he spent why didn't he write a sequel to the Lord of the Rings? Well, there wasn't really one. I mean, it's like he tried, and it became too depressing, so he dropped that. He tried writing back to all of these readers because he was so happy to have an audience finally. So just to remind you yet again, it's like the famous, if they actually put their heart into their work, don't know that they're going to become famous. If they write to a formula and they write to something that they're certain is already out there and established, you're not going to be talking about them in 100 years. Right. So, and Tolkien in another context, saying, the book has come out. I think this is writing to his publisher. I'm a little scrambled. I've forgotten exactly where all these quotations come from. The quotations, whether the citation is up to the internet, I suppose. When he says, I've exposed my heart to be shot at. I've exposed my heart to be shot at, because he so dreaded the publication of the book that we all love, right? So it's you put yourself under a significant amount of risk if you do something that everybody in the world is telling you doesn't fit, right? Okay, you still want to do it? I mean, I'm sure we do. I'm sure we do, because we love Tolkien and we want to understand as writers, and hopefully also as readers, what, like, where did it come from? Everybody always asks writers, like, where did you get your ideas? Where did it come from? Why were you able to write this book when so many other writers can't? Like, where does it actually come from? Well, we know, okay, so this is like, some people try, right? I have some examples of people trying here. Okay, I have chatter in my chat tonight. Casey saying, exactly, I started wanting to write because I wanted to read stories that interested me. Yes. But the thing is, like, if you're actually following people's advice, I'm going to go back to, forget the Rings of Power. Well, that was a punchline that I've now blown, right? Okay, so because I've forgotten what order my slides are in, and I don't have my partners to help me through the exercise. Okay, so we're saying, if you're willing to go through what I just described, it's like we're all willing to, trudge with Frodo and Sam up the slopes of Mordor, because we know, like, the eagles come and rescue them eventually, right? But would you do it if you didn't know where you were going, and if you didn't know what the story was going to be? And as Tolkien writes to Christopher at one point when he's writing about the trek across Mordor, or I think they get stuck on the Emyn Muil and he doesn't know what to do with them, right? And again, in retrospect, everyone's always like, well, it's such a perfect plot and you must have known where it was going and you must have, like, seen it all clearly. And Tolkien's like, no, that's not the way writing works. And the great joy and you know just not just pleasure, but lifting of our hearts that we get from reading Tolkien is because he was willing to put himself through that, I would say, hell, horror. It's the writer's horror is peculiar, right? You're just sitting there looking at the blankness and you don't know where the next step is coming from, and you get that with the hobbits walking across. So you're with me now, right? You want. Oh yes, Professor Fulton, we want to know how to write like Tolkien, right? Okay, well, um understanding that although fantasy is now the battlefield of its own great culture, subset sub battle of the culture war, creating the genre in the first place at all was already Lewis and Tolkien's venture into the culture war, which was, nobody's writing the kinds of stories we want to read, which is the greatest exercise you can make in saying, we're going to fight the culture war. Nobody's writing the kinds of stories I want to read. I better write them myself. Okay. So everybody with me? I got some chat going on in the chats, and at least my own team is saying they're with me. Okay, great. Right. How do you do it? Right? How do you do it? Well, for example, someone who people are talking about right now because they're curious about his writing process, Neil Gaiman. I was researching, you want to write like Tolkien this morning. It's saying, it's like, who answers this question? Here's a quote, a quotable quote from Neil Gaiman. You want to be the next Tolkien? He says, don't read big Tolkien-esque fantasies. Tolkien didn't read big Tolkien-esque fantasies, which Gaiman should say he couldn't. There weren't any. Right? I mean, Tolkien, you could say Tolkien maybe wrote, Proust or James Joyce. They were those, but he didn't. I don't know if he liked either of them anyway. He read books on Finnish philology, sort of, right? And Gaiman goes on, you go and read outside your comfort zone. Okie dokie. We got to read outside our comfort zone. Go and learn stuff. And then the most important thing, once you get any level of quality, okay, so we're assuming that there is such a thing as a level of quality in the writing that we want to achieve but that comes from learning stuff. But Gaiman doesn't really talk about in this particular passage how you get there. Get to the point where you want to write and you can write is tell your story. Don't tell a story anyone else can tell, because you always start out with other people's voices. And he says, I tell my story and nobody else can write my story. I don't know whether there's like deeper levels of Gaiman advice about writing his stories out there, but this is the usual way that people talk about the writing process, right? Find your voice. Find your voice. Hands up, class, whether you think Tolkien was trying to find his voice. I'm used to being able to have an answer right. I've got my headphones in so I can do my background music and stuff like that, and also because I'm autistic enough that I need the like comfort zone of being exactly in the same space to be able to do this at all. Tolkien was probably he's a little fidgety and fitful like that. Everything has to be exactly right. He keeps rewriting his maps and his. But what Gaiman seems to suggest is you read outside your comfort zone and then you find your own voice. Okay, that's I think we actually need a little bit more help. So I found some other help on TV tropes, which is it was pretty useful. It says be the next J.R.R. Tolkien. Like J.R.R. Tolkien himself, you could teach yourself dead languages at the age of 7. I'm not quite sure that that's what he was doing at the age of 7. He was inventing dragon stories at that point. Yes. Anyway, live in an idyllic rural setting with your mom until she dies. Well, they'd actually moved into town before that, but anyway. And you have to go live in a bleak industrial town. Be forbidden to see the love of your life for years until you could barely relate to each other anymore. Go fight in the biggest and bloodiest war ever fought in your time. Watch your friends die on a battlefield where death is the only victor. Fall ill and while in hospital begin writing of a better world. Middle Earth has Sauron over it. It's not really simply better. And I refer you to my maybe penultimate episode in the Forge of Tolkien, Gondolin, for what Tolkien first wrote. Return home to find your childhood ideals ruined in the name of progress. Spend 20 years immersed in the dusty recesses of academia, getting a pretty plum job at the time in the process, but never mind. And then finally set pen to paper, make the word sing. Or you could take the easy route and just read the simple guide. Now, this is, as a précis, that's not bad. Again, it's like everybody always wants to be Tolkien without being Tolkien, without actually having to go through the kinds of experiences that he did. He was, orphaned, doubled orphaned. His father died when he was 4. His mother died when he was 10 or 11. I forgot my dates. Sorry. His guardian, Father Morgan, prevented him from talking to Edith Bratt until they were both like mature. She was a few years older than Tolkien, so he had to wait until he reached his maturity. He goes off to war, sees half of his closest friend group die, and now you can write, the great fantasy. No, we want shortcuts. We want schema and tropes. And okay, here's the necessary tropes. Your chosen genre is high fantasy, which we've established did not exist when Tolkien started writing. So if you want to be Tolkien, write in a genre he invented. So magic is essential. Oh, wait, magic. Well, no, they go on to say Tolkien had very little magic. So he could be very vague about the precise rules. You have to choose what rules the magic follows, but Tolkien doesn't even use magic. So we're going to, if you want to be like Tolkien, you write in a genre that he invented and then break all the rules that he actually set for it, which is it's not really about magic. They include other things. You have to have your magic. Wait. No, you have, the setting will be generic high medieval or a world of your own creation. This is where everybody always thinks you want to start. And I do say, I teach my University of Chicago Tolkien class every 3 years, and I constantly do with them what I'm trying to explain to you tonight that we do with our own work in the Dragon Common Room. And I say, you can write something that you want to read, but for that class it has to be within Tolkien's world, right? And I regularly have students ask me, can I do world building? Can I write my own story? And is that Tolkien enough? And I say, no, you have to write in Tolkien's world. But the usually I think what people mean when they say they want to write like Tolkien is they need a map, and a history. So, and this is actually what they say in the TV trope. So we want, once you got a map, it's time to write the history. Map and history. And a romance. And high medieval. And some magic, which Tolkien didn't really I started saying, as I was reading this, I was like, what are the things they're going to say? Oh, battles, right? We need battles because fantasy always has battles. Well, if you read Tolkien properly, you realize the battle scenes aren't that great. I mean, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is great because it's, John Sobieski's charge, to relieve the siege of Vienna. Yeah. Which isn't high medieval. It's early modern. But in fact, Tolkien doesn't, I mean, as far as I can tell, he didn't fence. I can't tell whether he fenced. Did he play cricket? I'm not sure. But in for example, the Battle of Helm's Deep, when famously Gimli and Legolas are doing their competition about how many orcs they've killed, the main battle activity that you see of Aragorn is Anduril slashed. Right? It's not even Aragorn wielding his own sword. So Tolkien does not actually write great combat scenes. I know. Balrog, Gandalf, it's a whip, he gets dragged. No, it's like, so magic that he doesn't actually use that much of. And that the elves deny is magic anyway. It's like high tech that everybody just misunderstands. So is it magic? He doesn't really do battle scenes. Some of the other tropes that the TV tropes say you need are different races. Again, I think default into maps, history, dwarves. Okay, fine. A big bad, right? And this is where E.O. Wilson, Edmund Wilson, was convinced that Tolkien wasn't actually that good at this when he first reviewed Fellowship of the Ring. Yeah, it was Fellowship of the Ring. He had somehow he talks about the spider being scary, so he must have read the whole thing. I don't know. That as far as Tolkien's contemporary readers were concerned, he wasn't that scary. Now, maybe as we've receded in time from World War II or World War I, it seems scarier to deal with the actual media environment that Tolkien has understood that he was in. See previous episode in Mosaic Ark on Sauron's mic, that in fact Tolkien's the scariest thing about the big bad that he gets isn't so much the monsters, which again Wilson said weren't scary at all, but the sort of feeling of being under this surveillance state, right? So, well, usually what people think they want is another Gandalf Balrog battle. So, okay, big bad. Pitfalls, you can't have too many good gods. If they stay off stage, people will ask why they aren't more helpful. If they're on stage, the heroes will get overshadowed. Make sure to make the elves flawed. Okay, so if it's good versus evil, don't make them too good. Well, I mean, that's actually decent advice, is saying that you want the conflicts that the characters have to go to be actually difficult and challenging. And this is again what Wilson was saying Tolkien failed at, but okay, so that's decent advice. There's subversions, okay, and then you're going to have potential themes, motifs, plots. Once we get to the motifs and plots, set designing, location scout, props, costume, casting, stunt department, and you will have achieved by way of these tropes the Rings of Power. You see, it was better joke at the right time that time, right? So the Rings of Power is a perfect demonstration of why there's something missing. There's something missing in, it's like you've got the battle, okay, so it's the girl boss. Again, we did an episode on this in Mosaic Ark 2 years ago on her likeness to Joan of Arc, Gladriel's likeness to Joan of Arc, sorry. And, the sort of problem of the cross-dressing female warrior. Our artist for Draco Alchemicus Act 1, Zay Nuno Fraga, just put up a new Catholic comics on St. Joan. Pray for us. Something's going amiss with high fantasy. If what you need is high fantasy, magic, different races, a big bad, and plot and costumes and costumes, right? And yet it's still, as I think most of the Tolkien fandom acknowledges, something was seriously amiss with the Rings of Power. And having not watched it, other than to watch the video, the previews, and to decide I never wanted to see it, um, I could tell that from simply watching the previews, right? So why was I so certain that the Rings of Power had nothing to do with writing like Tolkien, right? And I can say that I didn't need to see the series, the action. I could tell simply from the previews and the feel of the language that was quoted and the something 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 it was missing, right? So we have some sense that there is an essential quality to Tolkien's world building that has more to do more, there's more to it than simply the surface aesthetic, I suppose is the thing. Right. What's missing? Right. What's you see, I'm much better at this when I get to do this in class, and I get to talk to people and ask them questions and say what would you say is missing? Well, Ursula Le Guin. See, if you give me doing class, I actually have like references, and I have to look stuff up and everything. So Ursula Le Guin, herself a great craftswoman of fantasy, has some lovely essays on this problem of writing fantasy and what it's about. It's in the collection called The Language of the Night. And the essay that I love bringing to the students' attention at this point in the question, right? It's like, you want to write like Tolkien. You love the stories that he crafted, and you love being in them. You love having this feel of being in this world, which he simply called Middle Earth because that's the Old English term for, as he says in his letters, our habitation, right? I have whole lectures on, Tolkien's, geography and historical chronologies and things like that. His premise always was that he was simply writing about Earth, right? Middle Earth, just in a historical time. That Lewis, when they decided that they were going to do the kinds of stories that they both liked reading, Lewis wanted to do space stories. They say that they flipped a coin, but I think that's a sort of abstract description of Lewis really preferred space travel stories, and he was a big astronomy buff. We should probably do a proper Mosaic Ark episode on what Lewis was up to, because it's fascinating and lovely in itself. It's different from what Tolkien was doing, even though he put Tolkien in one of his space travel stories as Ransom the philologist. Anyway, Lewis did the space travel stories. Tolkien said he wanted to do the history, the time travel stories. He was always trying to travel back in time, and this is where Gaiman did get it right in that little quote, studying not just Finnish philology, but philology as such, and not just because it's like fancy vocabulary, right? That Tolkien understood philology as an exercise in like reconstructive history, that you get it's like archaeology of words. You get a word that then carries with it this whole story that it comes to painting. So again, when people are making up names because they think that that's what Tolkien did, he sort of decorated, made fancy names, and if I have the sort of elvish sounding, no, Tolkien was crafting his languages to have both philological structure, also music. I talk about all of these things in the Forge of Tolkien. So you can see all of them right now if you subscribe on Unauthorized. I'm going to start releasing them on YouTube over the next year. Two of them are up now. The opening sign, what kind of story have we fallen into, and a taxonomy of dragons if you want to taste. Anyway, that Tolkien, he's playing with this problem of creating a history that has been lost, right? So that's necessary. But again, there's something else that's going on that's not just, again, the kind of things that people tend to think about with the world building. Can you imagine what it could possibly be? Well, what Le Guin says is she has in this essay, it's called From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, and she says it's the style. It's quite frankly the crafting in not just the well, it's everything, right? And she has these wonderful things with the point about fantasy. She says it's just saying, what is fantasy? On one level, of course, it's a game, a pure pretense with no ulterior motive whatever. It's the one child saying to another, let's be dragons. And then they're dragons for an hour or two. It's escapism of the most admirable kind, the game played for the game's sake. On another level, she goes on though, it's still a game, but a game played for very high stakes. Seen thus as an art, not spontaneous play, its affinity is not with daydream, but with dream. It's a different approach to reality, an alternative technique for apprehending and coping with existence. It is not anti-rational, but para-rational, not realistic, but surrealistic, super-realistic, a heightening of reality. It deploys archetypes, which, as Jung warned us, are dangerous things. Dragons are more dangerous and a good deal commoner than bears. Fantasy, she says, is nearer to poetry, to mysticism, and to insanity than naturalistic fiction is. It is a real wilderness, and those who go there should not feel too safe. And their guides, the writers of fantasy, should take their responsibilities seriously. Okay, that's pretty big deal, right? It's like you're ready for that, right? You want, yes, fantasy. It's again world building. It's archetypal. It's mystical. It's a wilderness. It needs guides. Let's go there. And she says, well, that's great, right? How are you going to get there? Well, if you're watching a movie, you have the visuals, you have the music, you have, well, it's audio visual primarily at the moment. We don't have smell and touch yet, but that you are in a different kind of medium. But she's talking about, as we are with Tolkien, written, the writing of the fantasy, right? And she's saying, how do you do it? How do you get there if all you have are, in fact, words? Well, what are words, right? There's a choice, there's a vocabulary choice, there's the grammatical structure, there's the phrasing and such. And she's saying most of the time people worry about, at least the kinds of conversations I hear, it's like plot, right? Can you keep all the characters active? And or it's the TV tropes actually points out that if you're doing high fantasy, you can't have too much psychological realism, which I don't think is actually true. I think most people default to psychological realism in their storytelling, but you want to be able to, through words alone, give your readers a sense that they're in this dream, something like that, right? And say that Tolkien's writing it as if Middle Earth is simply our habitation, and if you do the map, it maps nicely onto Europe, and Gondor is near Florence or whatever. But Le Guin is saying there's something else that's going on that is simply actually at the level of the style. And she's saying, I'm going to give you an example of what happened. And I've forgotten how she set this up. She's saying that a lot of the fantasy we read somehow doesn't work, right? Why doesn't it work? Okay, well, here's an example. She says, I got this book, I was reading this passage about great lords of Elfland, both of them. And you think about what happened in the Rings of Power, and why it failed, and why you could tell it was going to fail simply from the previews. It's something like this, right? Okay, so she's saying, here's a little excerpt from what I read. I sent a book to read, and here's a little excerpt from what I read. The persons telling are a duke of the royal blood of a mythical Celtic kingdom and a warrior magician, great lords of Elfland, both of them. Whether or not they succeed in the end will depend largely on Kelson's personal ability to manipulate the voting. Can he? Morgan asked as the two clattered down a half flight of stairs and into the garden. I don't know, Alaric, Nigel replied. He's good, damned good, but I just don't know. Besides, you saw the key council lords. With Ralston dead and Bran Chorus practically making open accusations. Well, it doesn't look good. I could have told you that at Cardosa. I mean, that's fantasy, right? It's great lords and gardens and Alaric and Nigel and Bran Chorus and Cardosa. Le Guin goes on. At this point, I was interrupted, perhaps by a person from Porlock. I don't remember. This is the joke about Coleridge not being able to finish Xanadu because he's interrupted by someone from Porlock. Yes, we talked about that in a previous episode too. And the next time I sat down, I happened to pick up a different kind of novel, a real now novel, naturalistic, politically conscious. Oh, right. I should say she's writing this in 1973. A real now novel, naturalistic, politically conscious, relevant, set in Washington, D.C. Here is a sample of conversation from it between a senator and a lobbyist for pollution control. Whether or not they succeed in the end will depend largely on Kelson's personal ability to manipulate the voting. Can he? Morgan asked as the two clattered down a half flight of stairs and into the White House garden. I don't know, Alaric, Nigel replied. He's good, damned good. But I just don't know. Besides, you saw the key committee chairman. With Ralston dead and Bran Corliss practically making open accusations, well, it doesn't look good. I could have told you that. Poughkeepsie. Okay, you see what she did, right? And she says, now I submit that something has gone wrong. The book from which I quoted first is not fantasy for all its equipment of elves and wizards, of heroes and wizards. If it was a fantasy, I couldn't have pulled that dirty trick on it by changing 4 words. You can't clip Pegasus' wings that easily, not if he has wings. Okay, you realize okay, so that passage is from one of Catherine Kerr's Elfland books, which I've never bothered to read because why would I? I don't want to read about Washington if I think I'm reading fantasy. Oh, well, maybe. I mean, one, you can see that if you've read enough Tolkien, that's why you can see through all of the machinations of our pleasant politicians, because he very consciously made one of his wizards into a politician. That's Saruman, who talks just like all the politicians do. His other characters don't. And what Le Guin is showing in this example is there's more to fantasy than the fancy names, and even the fancy locations. If you haven't got the style of the storytelling exactly right, it breaks. Nothing works. All you are is, guys at a Ren Fair dressed up in costume. And you're not even failing to keep character, you're failing even to lift yourself out of the fact that you guys are just in costume. And that I put to you is all I saw happening in Rings of Power, even in just the previews. And that's what we talked about in the Galadriel episode 2 years ago, that, putting women in armor or, boxing rings at the Olympics doesn't transport you into any other world except our own. Right. So but we agree, of course, that Tolkien achieved something else. How did he do it? Right. Why does Tolkien's writing work and E.O. Wilson hate it when we read it and love it? And there's something rapturous, numinous about what he's able to do with his language. And it definitely, I mean, it's like, again, I'm repeating myself a lot because I want you guys to go watch the whole series. That if you've read Tolkien, you are with Frodo when he goes to Rivendell and suddenly finds yourself inside a song, or when he's in Lorien and finds himself inside a song, or when Sam in the Field of Cormallen weeps for joy, finding himself inside a song. How do you get inside song? Well, then she gives an example of some stylist works, right? So she chose these carefully, but picks passages at random with the proof that the style is throughout in the writing. The first one is Um, she says she doesn't include Dunsany. Um, well, anyway, just listen to these, and they're three different styles, but they actually all work. Now spake Spitfire, saying, "Read forth to us, I pray thee, the book of Grow. For my soul is set afire. My soul is a fire to set forth on this faring. My soul is a fire to set forth on this faring." You see what just happened there? "'Tis writ somewhat crabbedly," said Brandock Daha, "and most damnably long. I spent half last night a searching on it, and 'tis most apparent no other way lieth to these mountains save by the Maruna, and across the Maruna is, if Grow says true, but one way." "If he say true," said Spitfire, "he's a turncoat and a renegado. Wherefore, therefore, not a liar." And that one's from Edison the Worm Ouroboros. Second example comes from Kenneth Morris, The Book of the Three Dragons. "Detestable to me truly is loathsome hunger, abominable an insufficiency of food upon a journey. Mournful, I declare to you, is such a fate as this to one of my lineage and nurture." "Well, well," said Dignor Unfulian, with the bitter hunger awakening in him again. "Common with me is knowledge of famine. Take you the whole of the food, if you will." "Yes," said Goro, "that will be better." Okay, and the third example you'll recognize. "Who can tell," said Aragorn, "but we will put it to the test one day. May the day not be too delayed," said Boromir. "For though I do not ask for aid, we need it. It would comfort us to know that others fought also with all the means that they have." "Then be comforted," said Elrond. Now, if you compare those passages that Le Guin selected with the ones that she took from Kerr, and realize you can't simply change the names and have it broken, right? You can't just say, well, it's in Washington D.C. and Poughkeepsie, and it suddenly switches so that you realize you're not hearing a story of Elfland, you're hearing a story of Politic Land, right? I put to you that there's pretty much nothing out there that is not political land, and it was interesting in the TV tropes examples they give some, it's like the greats, right? David Eddings, which was one of her examples, correct? No, Edison, sorry, it's like David Eddings, The Deed of Poxenarian by Elizabeth Moon. Now, I do say Deed of Poxenarian is magnificent, and Elizabeth Moon studied with the same medievalist I did. She's older than I am, but was at Rice where I was an undergraduate. She and I both studied with Catherine Drew. It's I don't think the style quite achieves what it does, but Deed of Poxenarian definitely achieves more. George R.R. Martin, I cannot read, will not read, and have no desire to read because he's mocking this entire premise. The Wheel of Time, never tried it. Dune, okay, now Herbert actually does achieve more in Dune than maybe people appreciate, right? We did 2 or 3 episodes on Dune back in the winter, and Dune is worth doing this test on. Then they say Babylon 5, the best TV space opera effort, and a Guy Gabriel Kay. I haven't read Gabriel Kay since I was in college, probably, so I'm not sure. But my guess is, in fact, the list is always even shorter, right? Terry Pratchett, I think, achieves a magnificent style, but his is of sort of comedic satire and is not the same as this level of Elfland that Le Guin is pointing to, and almost nobody writing now can achieve it. Why? Well, you'd think, as Le Guin goes, she says, we all want to write like this. Why is it so hard to accomplish? Well, she's saying, we went to imitate. Okay, maybe we'll just imitate it. We'll imitate it. If they're using inverted syntax. Well, invert the syntax. That'll do. That'll do. And, oh, right. Say thee and thou. She says, aha, says our novice. You have to use verbs with thee and thou. But nobody knows how to use them. And they certainly don't know how to use the second person singular verbs in the present. So that breaks, right? Then our novice saying, we're going to imitate, say, Lord Dunsany, or, you had from the Edison example, read forth to us, I pray thee, the book of Grove, for my soul is a fire to set forth on this faring. Say, okay, it's because you say thee and thou and the subjunctive. Yes, the subjunctive. Our novice tries to use the subjunctive. All the wases turn into wers and leap out at the reader snarling. And the Quakers have got us all fouled up with about which really is the nominative form of thou. Is it thee or isn't it? No, thou is you, thee is whatever. And then there's the she to whom trap. I shall give it to she to whom my love is given. Him whom this sword smite shall surely die. Give it to she, him shall die. It sounds like Tonto talking to the Lone Ranger. This is distancing with a vengeance. But we aren't through yet. No, we haven't had the fancy words. Eldritch, Tenebris, Smaragd. You know what smaragds are, right? Right. And Chalcedony. It's emeralds and rubies, right? Mayhap. It can't be mayhap. It can't be perhaps. It has to be mayhap unless it's perchance. And then comes the final test, the infallible touchstone of the seventh rate. Ichor. You know ichor. It oozes out of severed tentacles and beslimes tessellated pavements and bespatters bejeweled courtiers and bores the bejesus out of everybody. Okay, so this is what's funny about the problem here, right? It's saying we recognize that something indeed magical is happening that is transporting us somehow to Elfland through the conversation that Aragorn, Boromir, and Elrond have. And we can't figure out what it is. Now, the stakes, as Le Guin concludes, are in fact extremely high. And therefore, it matters that we get this right. It matters absolutely, particularly if we want to write fantasy, and particularly if we want to write the kind of numinous prose, the pointing to, it's like the numen is the mystic, right? That if you want to point to a mystical reality, to a transcendent something like fairy, if you want your readers to have that sense that there is something beyond this world, behind the shimmering veil of rain that you pass through as Tom Bombadil's washing, or Goldberry's washing comes down and cleanses the earth, that you want, it's like maybe archetypes will do it. Is that gonna work? It's style, and this is what she says is so important about it. Why is style of such fundamental significance in fantasy? Just because a writer gets the tone of a conversation a bit wrong, or describes things vaguely, or uses an anachronistic vocabulary or shoddy syntax, or begins going a bit heavy on the I chord before dinner, does that disqualify the book as fantasy? Just because the style is weak and is inappropriate, is that so important? Yes, that is so important. And she says, I think it is because in fantasy, there is nothing but the writer's vision of the world. There is no borrowed reality of history or current events or just plain folks at home in Peyton Place. There is no comfortable matrix of the commonplace to substitute for the imagination, to provide ready-made emotional response and to disguise flaws and failures of creation. There is only a construct built in a void with every joint and seam and nail exposed. And that means every word that you choose to put on the page, right? To create what Tolkien calls a secondary universe is to make a new world, a world where no voice has ever spoken before, where the act of speech is the act of creation. The only voice that speaks there is the creator's voice, and every word counts. Well, are you going to try now, right? I mean, we're going to go back to writing, romance novel set in some historical period and therefore anchor it to some other scene that we can rely on somebody else knowing about, and therefore we don't have every word counts. If you're writing fantasy, it's hey-ah. Iluvatar has spoken the world into reality, and every word counts. You terrified yet? You better be. This is bigger than dragons. It's bigger than being able to make sure you don't put a swamp next to the whatever what the TV tropes people say. You want to make sure your maps are right because yes, you don't want to put a swamp next to frozen tundra and spiral-shaped rivers that don't lead to the sea. Okay, fine. You need to know your geography. Tolkien loved walking. So, walking tours, a lot of what he describes of Rivendell as a famous valley in Switzerland. Every word counts. This is a verbal construction. This is storytelling at the crispest and most Olympic level of creation. Not fancy words, not the subjunctive, not these and thous. We don't want fake feeling and fake grammar. How do you do it? Is it even possible? Can you write like Tolkien? Well, what did Tolkien write like? That's what everybody always forgets to ask. Because, oh yes, he doesn't have, big fantasy books. But he did have models of what he wanted to write, right? And he and Jack Lewis are sitting there saying, nobody writes the kind of things we like to read. We'll have to write them ourselves. I'm so missing my class right now, you guys. I'll check in my Telegram chat. Okay. Hi guys on YouTube. Thank you for joining me. I don't know how to enable super chats yet because this is our maiden voyage for the Mosaic Ark as YouTube streaming. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll figure it out by next week. Right now, and Mel, you're gonna have to tell me where they're saying these things because I can't see them. I don't have that turned on yet. What do you think? Where does it come from, right? How is Tolkien able to write like Tolkien? There's a riddle in it, right? Okay, there's a riddle in it. You guys like riddles, right? How many of you, when you're reading our favorite book, skip the poems? Oh, everybody's hands just went, oh, like they're boring, right? Who reads the poems? They just drag and drag and drag and drag. And what do you need the poetry for? That's not battles. Wait, no, some of it is because that's the best, like the best, the best descriptions of what happens to the Rohirrim are in the poems. And most of the backstory, like the really super duper significant backstory. This one I chose, right? Because it has the effect of what happens to Frodo when he's at Rivendell, right? Talk about the way the words create the world. Frodo was left to himself for a while, for Sam had fallen asleep. He was alone and felt rather forlorn, although all about him the folk of Rivendell were gathered. But those near him were silent, intent upon the music of the voices and the instruments, and they gave no heed to anything else. Frodo began to listen. At first, the beauty of the melodies and of the interwoven words in elven tongues, even though he understood them little, held him in a spell. As soon as he began to attend to them, almost it seemed that the words took shape, and visions of far lands and bright things that he had never yet imagined opened out before him, and the firelit hall became like a golden mist above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. Then the enchantment became more and more dreamlike until he felt that an endless river of swelling gold and silver was flowing over him, too multitudinous for its pattern to be comprehended. It became part of the throbbing air about him, and it drenched and drowned him. Swiftly he sank under its shining weight into a deep realm of sleep. There he wandered long in a dream of music that turned into running water, and then suddenly into a voice It seemed to be the voice of Bilbo chanting verses, faint at first, and then clearer ran the words. Oh, well, no, okay, let's skip it. You don't want to skip it. You want to be in this world. You want to go here, into the shining deep that drenched and drowns, the dream of music that turned into running water and then suddenly into a voice. It seemed to be the voice of Bilbo chanting verses, faint at first, and then clearer ran the words. Arindal was a mariner that tarried in Nevernian. He built a boat of timber felled in Nimbrithal to journey in. Her sails he wove of silver fair, of silver were her lanterns made. Her brow he fashioned like a swan, and light upon her banners laid. In panoply of ancient kings and chained rings he armored him, and shining shield was scored with runes to ward all wounds and harm from him. His bow was made of dragon horn, his arrows shone of ebony, of silver was his habergeon, his scabbard of chalcedony. His sword of steel was valiant, of adamant his helmet tall, an eagle plume upon his crest, upon his breast an emerald. Beneath the moon and under star he wandered far from northern strands, bewildered on enchanted ways beyond the days of mortal lands. From gnashing of the narrow ice where shadow lies on frozen hills, from nether heats and burning waste, he turned in haste, and roving still on starless waters far astray, at last he came to night of naught, and passed, and never sight he saw of shining shore nor light he sought. The winds of wrath came driving him, and blindly in the foam he fled, from west to east, and errandless, unheralded, he homeward sped. Their flying Elwing came to him, and flame was in the darkness lit, more bright than light of diamond, the fire upon her carcanet. The Silmaril she bound on him, and crowned him with the living light. And dauntless then, with burning brow, he turned his prow, and in the night, from other world beyond the sea, there strong and free a storm arose, a wind of power and Tarmanel, by paths that seldom mortal goes. His boat it bore with biting breath, as might of death across the grey and long forsaken seas distressed. From east to west he passed away. Through Evernight he back was borne on black and roaring waves that ran, o'er leagues unlit and foundered shores that drowned before the days began, until he heard on strands of pearl, where ends the world, the music long, where ever foaming billows roll, the yellow gold and jewels wan. He saw the mountain silent rise, where twilight lies upon the knees of Valinor and Eldamar, beheld afar beyond the seas. A wanderer escaped from night, to haven white he came at last, to elven home the green and fair, where keen the air, were pale as glass, beneath the hill of Ilmarin, a glimmer in a valley sheer, the lamplit towers of Tirion are mirrored on the Shadowmere. He tarried there from errantry and melodies they taught to him, and sages old him marvels told, and harps of gold they brought to him. They clothed him then in elven white, and 7 lights before him sent, as through the Calicurian to hidden land forlorn he went. He came into the timeless halls, where shining fall the countless years, and endless reigns the elder king in Ilmarin on mountain sheer. And words unheard were spoken then of folk of men and elven ken beyond the world, where vision showed, forbid to those that dwell therein. A ship then new they built for him of mithril and of elven glass, with shining prow, no shaven oar nor sail she bore on silver mast. The Silmaril as lantern light and banner bright with living flame, to gleam thereon by Elbereth herself was set, who thither came, and wings immortal made for him, and laid on him undying doom, to sail the shoreless seas and come behind the sun and light of moon. From ever even's lofty hills, where softly silver fountains fall, his wings him bore a wandering light beyond the mighty mountain wall. From world's end then he turned away, and yearned again to find afar his home through shadows journeying, and burning as an island star. On high above the mists he came, a distant flame before the sun, a wonder ere the waking dawn, where grey the Norland waters run. And over Middle-earth he passed, and heard at last the weeping sore of women and of elven maids, in elder days and years of yore. But on him mighty doom was laid, till moon should fade, and orbed star, to pass and tarry nevermore. On hither shores where mortals are, for ever still a herald on, an errand that should never rest, to bear his shining lamp afar, the Flammifer of Westerness. The chanting ceased. Frodo opened his eyes and saw that Bilbo was seated on his stool in a circle of listeners, who were smiling and applauding. I put it to you that that's the reason you read Lord of the Rings and you didn't even read the poems. What if I told you that Tolkien makes no sense without the poetry? What if I told you that it's the poetry that makes Middle-earth? Now, this is ironic, of course, because everybody thinks a fantasy is something done in prose and we all skip the poems, right? Well, you don't skip the first poem because you wouldn't know what you were talking about if you skipped the first poem, because the whole point of the whole story is in the poem that I'm certain that you all memorized, just as I did when I was growing up, except for I can't find it. Right? Where's the ring poem? Do you know where the ring poem is? Did you memorize it when you were kids? Where's the ring poem? Ring verse. Three rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. The entire story depends on the poems. Everything of significance happens in the poems. The story is the poems. And so is most of the world building, right? And you could say, okay, so why does it work? Bilbo's song that Frodo hears tells the story of Arendelle and the Silmaril and the ship, right? You say the Mosaic Ark is in tribute to Tolkien because it's all a story about a ship carrying the story in the heavens. And you know, the ship is what Sam sees when he sees the star in the heavens and realizes that Galadriel's given him the light and that they're in the same story still. It's all from the poem. You don't even know what that light is. You have no idea what Sam is talking about on the stairs of Skirthungol when he gets to that moment when he says, Frodo, Master Frodo, what kind of story do you think we've fallen into? Well, you've fallen into a poem. You've fallen into a poem. A poem. Learn to scan, right? And this, it's interesting to me. Le Guin had said that in her saying, it's like the style is like poetry. It is poetry. It's literally poetry. And the rhythms and the heartbeat and the joy and the glory and the beauty of Tolkien is in the fact that his prose alliterates, for example, and scans. And it's even in the ring verse, right? 1 ring to rule them all. Ruh, 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 ruh. He's not just playing cellar doors with his imaginary language. He's alliterating. 1 ring to rule them all. 1 ring to find them. Now that actually is like there's a ruh, 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 and then not. I wonder where he learned to write like that. I wonder who his model was, who he thought he was talking about when he told Jack Lewis, I wish people would write the kinds of stories we like to read, the kinds of books we like to read. Well, they were meeting the group of them called the Inklings, right? And so a bunch of them came together and they wanted to write the stories that they liked and the kinds of stories they wanted to read. But there had been an earlier group called the Colbiters who were reading poetry. And we promise you, it's like this is, you know, technically, because I just got my Restream like renewal, the new season, right? This is the beginning of season 3 of the Mosaic Ark, and we promise we're going to be talking a lot about Tolkien's poetry in this next year, because oh yes, in September there's an entire 3-volume edition of Tolkien's poetry coming out, so we're gonna have an easy access to it and some scholarship and things like that. But Tolkien's first publications were poems. The thing that Tolkien was writing when he was with his friends in the tea club barrow stores, right? The 4 friends, 2 of whom died. And what did Tolkien do when he came back from war? He published the poems that his friends had written. He wrote poetry. The Dragon Common Room writes poetry. Absolutely everything we do is in tribute to Tolkien and in appreciation of the kind of world building that depends absolutely, utterly on poetry. A Rogue Wave says, first poem I ever memorized was the ring verse. Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. So Mel is helping me by sending me screenshots. Well, you guys, look how many of you are here. I'm so happy. Hello, Caravaggio, Baron of Grey Matter. Oh, and hi, Vita. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And Casey's there and the Daydreamer. Okay, well, I'm glad that we tried this experiment and that we are going to stream on YouTube now. Thank you for pushing me, Mel. Thank you guys have to all thank Mel because she wanted me to do this. So we'll be here from now on in YouTube as well, since it seems to enable more people to join and participate in the conversation. The poetry, right? I'm very happy you're all here. I feel quite touched, right? So we want to know, if we want to know how to get into the world that Tolkien was imagining, and as Le Guin has pointed out for us, it happens because of the style in which he was writing. And it happens, I was noticing that in one of her other examples, the Edison one, where you get the oops. Read forth to us, I pray thee, the book of Grow, for my soul is a fire to set forth on this faring. The alliteration on the F is quite obvious now, I hope. And so is the beat, right? And the primary thing you have to understand about the people who grew up in Tolkien's generation, he says he never liked poetry except for when he was growing up, when he was translating it into Latin. That back in the day, what people read was poetry. Let's see. Homer, it's poetry. Virgil, the Aeneid, great Latin, poetry. Ovid, the How to Seduce With. The original How to Pick Up Girls book is the Ars Amatoria by Ovid, poetry. Chaucer, which Tolkien, I've talked about this before, that there's this wonderful study, Tolkien's library and annotated checklist, right? It also includes lists of all of the lectures that he was giving. And I wanted to make sure that it's like, so for example, in 1928-29, his Michaelmas lectures included The Battle of Malden, poem, and verse from the Chronicle, the Old English Exodus, poem, Old English verse, poems, the Volsunga Saga, poems, and the Germanic verb, so you can write better poems. In Hilary term, he did the Old English Exodus, poem, Old English verse, more poetry, Volsunga Saga and related lays, poetry, Legends of the Goths, the Germanic verb, Trinity, Old English verse, Old Norse, Carmina Scaldita. What Tolkien mainly did in his professional scholarly career was teach about poetry. For example, Beowulf. You all know, it's like, if you love dragons, it's got to be Beowulf, right? It's a poem. Now, and poetry, right? It's like all of the things that Tolkien and Lewis were missing. And Lewis, he's a great Milton scholar. More poetry. The reason that Tolkien and Lewis and all of the people of their generation can write better than we do is they grew up having to learn to scan. And I had Shakespeare scans, iambic pentameter, right? If you love all of our great literature in English, I will say it again because I want you to believe me. And all I can do is emote right now, learn to scan. All right. Now, maybe we need some more examples. So, for example, Tolkien, he lectures on the Old English poems. He lectures on Chaucer. He, gets so tangled up in writing his own poems like Arundel the Mariner that he doesn't do that much scholarly publishing in his career, but he does manage to do modern English translations of more poems, right? So one is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which this is showing you one of the illustrations from the single manuscript that we have of Sir Gawain. I'm sure you could hear, now that I've read you some of the poetry Bilbo wrote, as it were. He said Aragorn only came up with the emerald, so they didn't say Smaragd, they said emerald in their Arundel poem. But that's green, right? So we'll read some of the Green Knight. Here we have the Green Knight. And this is Tolkien's modernized version of the Middle English poem. The Green Knight showed up at the Arthurian court, but who cares about that? What we need is the style so that you know, how do you get into fairy? Very gay was this great man guised all in green, and the hair of his head with his horses accorded. Fair flapping locks enfolding his shoulders, a big beard like a bush over his breast hanging, that with the handsome hair from his head falling was sharp shorn to an edge just short of his elbows, so that half his arms under it were hid, as it were in a king's capadoche that encloses his neck. The mane of that mighty horse was of much the same sort, were curled and all combed with many curious knots, woven in with gold wire about the wondrous green, ever a strand of the hair and a string of the gold. The tail and the toplock were twined all to match, and both bound with a band of a brilliant green, with dear jewels bedight to the dock's ending, and twisted them on top was a tight knitted knot, on which many burnished bells of bright gold jingled. Such a mount on middle earth or man to ride him was never beheld in that hall with eyes ere that time, for there his glance was as lightning bright. So did all that saw him swear, no man would have the might, they thought, his blows to bear. Now, if you rewrote that in modern description, guy shows up, he's green, his beard's a bit bushy, and he's got green jewels all over him, and he jingled. I promise we've been practicing with the iambic pentameter enough that it's hard for me to like break out of it once I get into it. This is not iambic pentameter, but it's Tolkien trying to achieve the alliterative verse that was popular among these poets in the 14th century. They're trying to write in the 14th century like the Old English poetry was written with the alliteration. So you get a big beard like a bush over his breast hanging, ba 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 ba. The line has to have the three alliterations in it. With a handsome hair from his head falling, right? With sharp shorn to an edge just short of his elbows. Everything, it's not just that every word counts, every sound counts, every syllable counts, every beat counts, every breath counts. The reason that you feel, as Frodo did, like you're in a song is you are. I mean, isn't that wonderful? The Lord of the Rings is a long song. Some of it's in prose, but most of it's actually in prose that is yearning to break into song, because it's in the song that in fact the enchantment happens. And that's, you can say that when I was reading the Arundel, that all of the things that we had saying what Frodo felt before hearing the song is what you feel when you read The Lord of the Rings, right? The words took shape, and visions of far lands and bright things that he had never yet imagined opened out before him, and the fire-lit hall became like a golden mist above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. Seas of foam that sighed. It's like Tolkien's going to fall into this rhythm and breath and beat, even when he's writing prose. Then the enchantment became more and more dreamlike until he felt like an endless river of swelling gold and silver was flowing over him. The flowingness, the river, is the beat of the meter, right? Arundel was a mariner that tarried in Avernian. It's also going to be in the satisfaction of the rhymes. That we have lost poetry is why we've lost all joy and hope and beauty in our present world. And the little scraps and glimpses of it that we catch because we read Tolkien, like Sam seeing Arundel in the heavens and recognizing that it's carried in the glass that Galadriel's given them and that they're about to like scare Shelob off with. And you can ridicule that and say it's a flashlight. But what you've done is break the poetry. He also rewrote The Pearl, which is a poem about heaven. And some of it you'll recognize that some of the Tolkien spent so much time describing, jewel-studded heavens, the sun and the moon as gemstones, right? Is because, okay, if you consider how hard it is to translate something, and then how hard it is to translate it into verse, and then recognize how much of his life Tolkien spent talking about these texts, and breathing them out, right? He had to do what I did, although he had them probably memorized better than I do. He certainly had Beowulf memorized. People love listening to what, right? The stride into the lecture hall and recite the opening of Beowulf, right? He has this stuff in his bones, in his heartbeat, in his muscles, in his body, so that when he writes his own stories, that's what happens. It lives in him because it's poems. As John the Apostle it did view, I saw that city of great renown, Jerusalem royally arrayed and new, as it was drawn from heaven down, of gold refined and fire to hue, of glittering glass was that shining town. Fair gems beneath were joined as dew, and courses 12 on the base laid down, that with tenon tables 12 they crown. A single stone was each tier thereon, as well described this wondrous town in Apocalypse the Apostle John. The rhyme scheme in these stanzas are quite complicated, and the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B, A, B, A, B, B. Okay, well, anyway, let me read this next one and see if you can feel the weaving of the sounds together and recognize that Tolkien, one, could do this in his sleep because this is what he trained on constantly. And it's the source of the magic, right? Fine, there's no magic in Tolkien because it doesn't have the magic is all in the words. It's all in the verse. It's all in the enchantment of the poetry. This is describing the heavenly Jerusalem in the 14th century poets' visions, translated by Tolkien so that it matches as closely as he could the 14th century Middle English. These stones doth John in writ disclose. I knew their names as he doth tell. As jewel first the jasper rose, and first at the base I saw it well. On the lowest course it greenly glows. On the second stage doth sapphire dwell. Chalcedony on the third tier shows a flawless pure and pale jewel. The emerald fourth so green of shell. The sardonyx the fifth that shone. The ruby sixth he saw it well. In the Apocalypse the Apostle John. And every stanza ends with the same line in the Apocalypse, the Apostle John. Uh, it repeats in these intricate interlockings. There's whole scholarship on Pearl. It's a beautiful poem. And it's not just because it lists gems. Right? It's like, look at how he's listing the gems. And it's the same thing that Le Guin is trying to say to you when you can't just write a scene, change the names, and not get out of Washington, D.C. unless you appreciate that the getting out of Washington, D.C. involves transforming the way in which you speak at this structural level. To them John then joined the chrysolite, the seventh gem in the ascent, the eighth the beryl clear and white, the twin-hued topaz as ninth was pent. 10th the chrysoprase formed the flight, 11th with jacinth excellent, the 12th most trusty in every plight, the amethyst blue with purple blent. Sheer from those tears the wall then went, of jasper like glass that glistening shone. I knew it, for thus did it present in the Apocalypse, the Apostle John. Right? Okay, so I hope that one shows you that Tolkien cared about working with language at a level that most in the TV tropes, they didn't say anything about style or the way you craft your language. They said costumes and plot and big bad, right? What Tolkien was doing was trying to do what his predecessors in our great storytelling tradition had done, which was craft the language to a level that it enchants. Right. Okay. I made those points that I wanted to, right? That say, we always know Tolkien, you need lore to write Tolkien, right? Well, he got all the lore that he got from poems. And we need to spend the last segment of this episode talking about one poem in particular that he's getting lore from, but he gets his lore from poetry, things like Beowulf, things like the Aeneid, things like the Kalevala. He spent his career working with poetry. It was not the novel is called the novel because it was new in modernity. The novel is the mode of composition for modernity. If you want to write in a medieval style, you must write in verse. his scholarship was mainly on poetry, on Beowulf, on the Exodus, and things like that. And his major translations included, yes, poetry. So, if you want to be writing like Tolkien, you need to be writing in verse. This is our children's poem that I hope many of you know, Aurora Borealis, and to show you that we are always, always, always inspired by and echoing and trying to learn from our master. It's got a polar bear in it, just like Tolkien's Christmas, Father's Letters from Father Christmas, right? The polar bear in this one, he's like falling down the stairs because he's always making mischief. Here, our polar bear is, you know, bursting into the seals, tormenting the panda, who is our mystic, and rescuing him. I mean, that he hasn't fallen down yet, but you know, he looks like he might. Likewise, in Aurora Borealis, after the polar bear with his other bear friends rescues the panda, they are taken to the ice city. And I mean, we have a genius artist, Colleen Coggins. Hi, Colleen, who did our, I'm not sure what she was looking at, because sometimes she would draw stuff and then we'd come back later and say, how did you know? That's exactly perfect. Anyway, it's clear that in order to get to Valinor, as Arundel does in the here, it's in the Tolkien drawing on this side, this is the mountain silent rise, where twilight lies upon the knees of Valinor and Eldamar, beheld afar beyond the seas. Our bears go, it's sort of a mixture of Father Christmas letters and sailing to Valinor, right? Because they go with the polar bear from the North Pole, which is where Father Christmas would be, to the South Pole, where they find the penguins in their ice city and, you know, have to ascend this mountain and find mysteries there, right? So we're in tribute to Tolkien at that level. And while they're in the ice city, well, it's not a dragon, it's a griffin, but seizes the panda and takes him out. Now, this is a story for children, and Tolkien obviously, you know, wrote many stories for children. He wrote one dragon story for children, The Hobbit, right? He writes other dragon stories like Roverandom has a dog and a dragon in it. There's a whole episode in The Forge of Tolkien called Three Dog Tolkien, because it's showing that, in fact, dogs and dragons go together for him a lot. We didn't have a dog in Aurora Borealis. We do in Draco Alchemicus. But this sort of, what are the dragons doing in the story? Well, they're you know, they are what Tolkien imagined, which was the rapture, right? That they take you out of ordinary Middle Earth into mythical Middle Earth, myth history Middle Earth, like the dragons do in Beowulf. And in Aurora Borealis, the griffin, who's also Christ figure, because that's the way Dante sees him. Dante, another great poet, seizes the panda as he's eating the offerings on the altar and takes him to his lair. The conclusion to the story is, of course, the Aurora, because that's what the animals have been in quest of, the Aurora Australis, as they've gone from the Aurora Borealis to the Aurora Australis. The Aurora Australis is in the Southern Hemisphere, and the Southern Hemisphere also has this magnificent constellation called the Southern Cross, which we have Colleen illustrate the griffin on, right? So please, it's obvious. The griffin is Christ, and we had not seen, I hadn't looked at the Father Christmas letters in a while, and we did this picture for Aurora Borealis of the glory that the bears behold of the griffin. And then I saw the glory that Tolkien did. As far as I'm concerned, we're channeling Tolkien, all right? We are the most accurate Tolkien followers on the planet alive right now. It's us. Because we can, without even meaning to get the same tropes and visuals and dynamic visions, end up in the same place he did, which to a certain extent is because I'm reading a lot of the same stuff Tolkien did. I'm a medievalist, and we're working in all of our storytelling with the sort of layering of symbolism and mythology and scriptural iconography for example, with the Heavenly Jerusalem that I just read to you from Pearl, that Tolkien knew, breathed, and prayed every day. So, again, I'm reassured that we're actually doing what Tolkien did, because we come to a similar sort of vision of reality with him, which includes, of course, um, this glory, right? But most of the time, people think Tolkien, they think dragons, right? So yes, our new story um, is Draco Chimicus, and the image that Zay did for us as a poster one is still sort of virtual for. It's not been published yet in a book, but we're probably we use it on posters and promotionals, and maybe the whole thing, if we can get a omnibus when we finish the 5 volumes. Tolkien, did 3, we're doing 5. No, will be there. But the dragon, obviously, of our inspiration is that trying to reclaim fantasy for Christ in much the same way that Tolkien understood his storytelling, which he said was always a fundamentally Christian work, even though he didn't necessarily always realize it, because he was writing so much from within the imagery of the stories that he himself was working on. I'm very excited, extremely excited, obviously, since we've been trying to write like Tolkien and trying to understand the degree to which poetry, which means metered in rhyme, can achieve cognitive experiences that simply prose can't, right? It's not to be precious. We do hope that we're writing like plainly and straightforwardly, in the sense of we don't torture our syntax. Uh, but this is the prologue to Draco Chimicus, just to show you that we're trying to mimic the master, even though he was writing poetry from when he was a child, and we just started 4 years ago. So give us another decade, we might catch up to his teenage version of things. But anyway, this is the prologue that we wrote for Draco Chimicus. In rainbow time, when dragons hoarded gold and pirates sailed the seas in search of spice, a city shimmered with electric cold, its storerooms stocked with precious merchandise, where dreams were bought and sold at dealer's price. A court convened, ruled by a sovereign snake, whose virtue was to capture slaves with vice. No spells could bind the alchemical drake, until one day a stranger came, its spells to break. He raids the city at the gate of night, a humble pigeon nestled at his breast, for he has come to play the game of light against the darkness of the dragon's breath, and win his love back from the jaws of death. A fairy queen has seized the merchant's trove and calls herself by name Elizabeth. The pirate king comes forth with hound and dove. He goes to war to slay the snake and claim his love. I'm very reassured to find all the alliteration in there, right? It's like we're trying. The stanza form that we're using is, in fact, Spenserian, so it's a 16th century rhyme scheme. The meter is iambic pentameter, so it's the meter that Chaucer wrote in, the meter that Milton wrote in. It's the standard heartbeat meter of English. And the ideal is to capture the Christian mythology in the art form that we understand as primary to our faith, which is the word, right? But it's the word as breathed through our bodies, and therefore as a rhythm, as a sound, as a exquisite joy that carries meaning with it, in the fact that it rhymes, that it scans, that it's spice, price, snake, break, vice, drake, break, right? That these things happen. If you're worrying about losing the culture, you've got to learn to scan. I'm just telling you, please learn to scan. Please take us seriously. If you don't want to learn to scan, just buy our books and read them, right? And we put pictures in all of them. It's like we have the Draco Chimicus there's the potion that the snake in Eliza form uses to make Adam and Eve, well, the newlyweds, make their mistake. And so we are also doing what Tolkien did, which is working within the mythology of, in fact, our Middle Earth, with the desire to capture that mystery that we experience as Christians and seeing ourselves made in the image and likeness of God. Now, again, I have two more examples that I want to share with you of why this is so important, right? This is not, the poetry is not accidental to the effect that the storytelling is having. It's not accidental to the world building. It's necessary to the world building, and it's utterly necessary to your experience of being enchanted. Without the poetry, you will not be enchanted. That's why George R.R. Martin does not enchant. It's why simply sticking a dragon in there and some fancy costumes, you can be hobbits and you will be more enchanted in ordinary day clothes than you will be in, shining the most expensive costumes that Peter Jackson can afford, right? It's the poetry that does it. It's the poetry that is grounding for the experience and the meaning. And that's why C.S. Lewis was persuaded to convert to Christianity, right? And there's a famous scene. They were on this walk, Addison's Walk, behind Magdalen College in Oxford one evening, and Lewis and Tolkien were already friends. This is 1933 or thereabouts, and they were already, reading the mythologies. Lewis had been reading mythologies for ages, and Tolkien had been Catholic. Grew up, his mother converted to Catholicism soon before she died, and Tolkien, made his Edith convert to Catholicism before they get married. No matter how much he loved her and waited for her for years, when he couldn't talk to her, he still wanted her to convert. So his Catholicism is central to his life, to his meaning, and he's trying to convince Lewis on this walk that they had. Hugo Dyson was with him. That it mattered that the myths were real, and it mattered that the myths were told, and it mattered that the myths were told in the way that they were. And in order to convince Lewis, he wrote a poem, and it's called Mythopoeia. It's the making of myth, right? He says, epigraph, to one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. And so it's Philomythus to Mesomythus. And okay, there is an episode called Mythopoeia in The Forge of Tolkien where I go through all of this line by line. It's iambic pentameter. We're going to read it very carefully. But so I'm not going to read it all now. But the point is that this poem is one of the absolutely critical, essential things that convinced Lewis to convert, because he apparently, after that conversation, did. And Tolkien included segments of this poem on fairy stories when he was trying to describe what it was he was up to, right? So he's writing fairy stories. He's writing something about this poem, and he's trying to explain to Lewis what we do as artists and why it matters so much. He's saying to Lewis, if you don't believe that these things are real and the names don't carry any truth in them, then you're not even human, right? So, for example, he's getting Lewis, because Lewis really likes, astronomy. He sees no stars who does not see them first. Of living silver made that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth, unless the mother's womb whence all have birth. None of the heaven and earth does not exist unless it exists at this mythological level. And therefore Tolkien's saying this is not like embroidery on top. It's not a costume for creation. It's the reality of creation. And so is our ability to be in it as thinking creative beings, right? This is the big passage. The heart of man is not compound of lies. Myths aren't just lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. Meaning our storytelling is not lying. It's what we do as sub-creators participating in that creation of the world that began with God's fiat. So we make still in the image and likeness in which you're made of a creator, we don't worship the artifact. We don't worship the creature. We worship the creator, and Tolkien did, right? He tells Christopher in one of my favorite letters of his saying, I say the praises every day. I say the Benedicite, where all the creatures praise the creator. I say the Psalm 148, the Laudate, because we're singing the praises, where the dragons from the deep sing for I say the praises. We praise, we sing praise, we sing. One of the most beautiful poems in the Lord of the Rings is when the eagles, my bird image that I started with, announce to the people of Gondor the salvation of the city, and it's a psalm. I'm gonna read that one. I'm in a stack of books. Where's my book? Okay, I'm gonna find the Eagles song. Well, there's the long live the halfling, praise him with great praise. Here's the eagle. This is clearly a psalm, and it's clearly like the most important moment. And before the sun had fallen far from the noon out of the east, there came a great eagle flying, and he bore tidings beyond hope from the lords of the west, crying. Remember, we're not supposed to have gods in fantasy, right? The lords of the west are the Valar, right? Sing now, ye people of the Tower of Anor, for the realm of Sauron is ended forever, and the dark tower is thrown down. Sing and rejoice, ye people of the Tower of Guard, for your watch hath not been in vain, and the black gate is broken, and your king hath passed through, and he is victorious. Sing and be glad, all ye children of the west, for your king shall come again, and he shall dwell among you all the days of your life. And the tree that was withered shall be renewed, and he shall plant it in high places, and the city shall be blessed. Sing, all ye people. And the people sang in all the ways of the city. So Tolkien is thinking in terms of the Psalms. He's thinking in terms of the praises. He's thinking in terms of the creators and the angels. And the magic is all there in the evocation of the poetry. Where did he learn to do this? Well, I've mentioned to you, got to rearrange my books here again, mentioned to you that Tolkien spent his career lecturing on text, and I read for you at random, because the eagle guides me tonight, or the dove, from his lecture series in 1928. So it included this text called the Old English Exodus. I wonder what the Exodus is about. Well, okay, so of all of the scholarly things that Tolkien managed to accomplish, one of them was the proper edition of the Exodus. It's in a manuscript called Junius 11, which, again, to prove yet again that we've been talking about Tolkien all along. Aren't you happy to have all the footnotes now? A few weeks ago, we were talking about Junius 11, which is a manuscript that has, among other things, a retelling of Genesis, which we tried to suggest, as others have had, and it's not just us who made the suggestion, was the inspiration for Milton's Paradise Lost, because it has such a vivid scene of the fall, and both the fall of the angels and the fall of Adam and Eve, which we are retelling in Draco Alchemicus, and it also has these wonderful line drawings that give you some sense of the drama that is going on here. The angels falling into the Hellmouth. Morgoth, it is there in seed, right? But the next poem in the manuscript it's not illustrated, so I can't show you a picture for that one. But it's the Exodus, and it's a wild, completely wild retelling of the story that sort of weaves in and out of, here's Moses leading the people out of Egypt, and there's a backstory of where they get all the treasure because Joseph brought them into Egypt, and then there's the knot battle. Guess who? If Tolkien likes telling stories about wizards and magicians with magic staffs who lead their people out of um, bondage. And he worked on a poem called Exodus. Moses is his primary wizard model, right? And we probably should do a whole episode on Moses. We haven't done that yet. We did talk about whether or not the medieval drawings of Moses with horns were meant to be diabolical. No, they're not. They're rays of power, right? The shining of his face after he sees God on the mountain. So in the Exodus, we have the poem, we have that scene, right? And I invite you to read it. You can read it in a beautiful, this is not Tolkien's translation, this is another beautiful translation. Craig Williamson's great complete English poems. And if you want to understand where Tolkien got his voice, I think maybe you may hear it now. Not from Williamson. Tolkien read the original Old English. Okay. So they're standing on the other side of the sea that's drowned Pharaoh and all of his hosts. And Moses spoke to the chosen people. So Moses spoke to the chosen people. Mighty is this multitude, powerful its leader. The Lord of heaven, our shield and support, who guides our journey. He has given us the hand of governance over the land and people of Canaan, their cities and treasures, their spacious kingdom. The Lord of angels will fulfill his promise. Carry out his covenant from your father's days, that if you respect his laws, revere his learning, his holy precepts, henceforth you will subdue all your enemies and occupy this kingdom between the two seas and rule the high halls of feasting and fellowship from this day forward. Your might will be unmatched, your glory great. At these wise words the host rejoiced, the troops were jubilant, the trumpets of victory sang a beautiful song of bright victory, and the banners were raised. All of the Israelites were home free on the shore. The heavenly pillar, the beam of glory, had guided them forward under God's gaze, protecting the host. You'll remember what Gandalf does with his staff, right? The warriors exulted. The people were ecstatic. They'd escaped alive from their enemy's power, risking their lives under the sea's ramparts raised from the deep. When the wave walls went up, the waters ran blood as they walked through the sea with their war gear on. After barely escaping the Egyptian army, the men raised a battle song, praising their protector in a loud voice. The women answered back with their own songs, lifting up a host of hymns to the Lord, celebrating the glory of his mighty miracle. Then it was easy to find the African woman, the Ethiopian beauty adorned with gold, the wife of Moses standing on the shore. Footnote, Tolkien was born in South Africa, and he was quite interested in this image of Ethiopia in the Old English literature. The wife of Moses standing on the shore. Then the sea remnant began to share out the treasure of armbands and neck rings, the Egyptian booty washed up on the shore, a people's plunder, the gift of the waves. Their bondage was broken, their reward revealed. They divided up the treasures, gold and silver, robes and rings, swords and shields, clothes and corselets, in turn by tribe. This was the wealth that Joseph had amassed, that the Egyptians took. Those treasure keepers, from king to soldier, pharaoh to follower, now slept in the sea, an untold host. Now, I can promise you, he lectured on this text annually. The thing is, it seems like from his lecture schedule, he when he was doing the editions of things, he lectured on things quite. He could lecture on a single text for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, right? I'm doing this in a couple hours. He would go back to these texts over and over and over again. If you want to world build like Tolkien, you're doing it with words, word building your world, and you need not to just work for the dictionary and therefore have know what weird means. But you also need to feel the sound of the words. It's not just philology as the historical exercise of art, art, figuring out what an int was. It's a giant, right? But it's the flavor and craft and weaving of words into these flowing constructions, right? Tolkien lectured on them, he translated them, he worked on them, he practiced writing them. If you want to learn to write like Tolkien, learn to scan. So that's what we've been doing in Draco Alchemicus and in Aurora Borealis. We did Centrism Games was entirely inspired by the Green Man, although it had some other layers inspiration from Alexander Pope and so forth. But it was the mischief maker in our Centrism Games was the Green Man modeled on the Green Knight. Basically, we're just following in Tolkien's footsteps pretty much in everything we do, and including in the central character of our Draco Alchemicus, which is the alchemical dragon. On the one hand, the dragon of magic, the dragon of transformation and alchemy and, silver and gold, englobing the world, right? And its twin, its counterpart, its scapegoat, mirror opposite, the brazen serpent, which is a Mosaic image. It's Moses's brazen serpent that he lifts up in the desert when the people are bitten by the serpents, and he lifts up the serpent on the staff, and the people who look upon it are healed. We're writing a Christ story, just like Tolkien. It's like he's writing these mariner stories. He's clearly writing Noah stories with the mariner imagery and the salvation from, he drowns Beleriand and he also drowns Numenor, and the people escape in arks, right? We're in the Mosaic Ark is both a Moses Ark of the Covenant and a Noah's Ark riding the floods. Tolkien's great dream, his great nightmare was of a flood. Numenor is a story not just of Atlantis, but of Noah. And, the Elendil character is a Noah character. It's all basically, if you want to understand Tolkien, you need to know the scriptures backward and forwards, because otherwise you're not going to catch how much of his imagery is always scriptural. But it's also the kind of poetry that he said every day in the Psalms and the praises and the prayers. So knowing that you all are watching and that Mel has some access to the chat. Oh, look, she's helping me. Okay, so here we go. Rogueway, G.K. Chesterton was the master of alliteration. Chesterton is another great example. He writes, we should do a whole, maybe for October 7th at some point, a whole episode on his Battle of Lepanto. It's an amazing poem, right? And his donkey poem is gorgeous. Beowulf. Caravaggio, yes. Poetry was intrinsic to the British at the time. Unfortunately, I believe we have largely forgotten about it today. Consider if we're in a culture war and people don't learn to scan. I had this in a class I teach on the Trivium, which is the language arts in the Middle Ages. And one of the first things we did was some of the kinds of exercises that medieval and early modern students would do, and it's learning to scan. And one of the students said, "Oh, if only I could write like Shakespeare." And I'm like, "Well, what do you think he did as a kid in school?" Scansion exercises. They wrote an iambic pentameter, and you can find a lot of it in, early modern English literature. Alexander Pope is really good at iambic pentameter, but basically everybody who went through school had to do it, right? Some people get really good at it, but the kind of drilling in the craft of the language, yes. In fact, in rhythmic battle hip hop or something, maybe we have it now, but the kind of training in the beauty of the voice is what we've lost, and consider why we don't have that and who ridicules you for wanting to have it. Casey says, learning to scan is learning how to actually construct a story. Yes, it's incredibly architectural and jewel-like, right? As we're writing our poems, it feels like making jewelry, including because talk about gold and gemstones, but it is actually a precision craft, like jewelry making. The economy of words forces you to do it. And Casey says, if you already know how to construct a story, learning to scan will help you construct it better. We've learned to write these. Poetry is so architectural in the mode that we're doing it with these, metered stanzas and so forth. You can't have a word out of place or it just jangles and breaks the whole thing. And, you have to write and write and write. It's like memes, right? If you guys like memes and you guys like the sort of precision of the juxtapositions of meaning and languages, if you love memes, you're going to love the kinds of poetry we're working on, because it's medieval symbolic semiotics, all the fancy words that you want to use about it. If you feel like it's silly and childish, this is the highest craft of humanity. Children don't learn nursery rhymes, right? It's like nobody likes Tom Bombadil. They cut Tom Bombadil out because they didn't realize that his entire singing and enchanting was the creation of the world. My Tom Bombadil episode in Forge of Tolkien goes through that. English done well is definitely a magic language. Yes. Thoughts on the second seeing of Rings of Power coming up? Well, if they talk to me or hire some of my students who actually learn to scan, they might get better writers, right? But it's interesting. They sloppily think that the magic is somehow in power when it's all in the craft of expression. English done well is definitely a magical language. Channeling Tolkien, woohoo, was our right. Yes, it's our right. Okay, so this is our apologia for why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to write the kind of books that we hope Tolkien would have at least appreciated we were trying to write. That it is grounded in a vision of the world as a creature that is, what I do in my scholarly work, very much like what Tolkien did in his scholarly work, is grounded in this medieval literature, grounded in this medieval reading of scripture, crafted in the beauty of our voice, and you can't do it without it. You cannot write the kinds of stories that you enjoy that Tolkien wrote without the same kind of verbal discipline that he put himself through. And Le Guin backs me up on that, right? It's in fantasy, every word counts. And if you train yourself at the level of poetry that Tolkien certainly did, and we're going to do this, right? We promise we're going to talk. It's like we feel like the gauntlet's been put down. It's like, why aren't you talking about Tolkien? We said we have been the entire time. That we will work through, at different levels, the kinds of things that he brought up in his poems, the love stories, the girl in her. I did a whole episode on Baron and Luthien and Luthien and her dog, right? It's like, you like girl boss. Luthien sings Morgoth to sleep, and her dog has a great battle with the werewolf. With Sauron as a werewolf, and then with the Hound. So, this is, we hope that you guys are encouraged by this manifesto. Just take a look at our poems. You can get the books from dragoncommonroom.com. They're on Amazon. We have lots of plans where we've got we have new artist for Act 2. It's a little different in character. It's Elizabethan tea party scene with, some backstory and storytelling, very sexy. We're in about third of the way through writing Act 3, which is tracking with a lot of the political spellcasting quite scarily. We're on a fairly multi-year journey, slowly, just like Tolkien was. But it's in tribute to his invitation. We make still by the law in which we're made. So thank you for joining me. We'll be back next week, live streaming Thursday next week to fit with our travel schedule and some summer schedule. But now that we know that the YouTube streaming works, we'll be streaming on YouTube as well as on Telegram and in Unauthorized. And we are very, very happy to welcome you all aboard the Mosaic Ark on our pilgrimage through the seas of Middle-earth. Thank you for joining us.